So welcome to everyone who's joining us on Facebook, especially those of you who are too scared to come out in the rain, sitting at home watching on the computer. Yeah, so well done to all of you. Welcome everyone, and also welcome to there. Is there anyone that hasn't been here before? We all know each other, yeah? Yeah, oh cool. Our topic tonight is life cycles of boards. And having a look at what happens to a board from the inception of when an organisation starts to when things happen through the journey of the life of an organisation. Everything that happens impacts on the governance and what does that look like, and having a look at some of the ways that boards behave during its lifespan. We're not going to have any power. Sorry, team. I have to do everything manually. Oh. Okay, right, so we're going to have a look at a life cycle model, and then we're going to, as we work our way through that, have a look at what I call maximising life cycle opportunities, which means that if our board is going through these different phases and different ways of behaving according to the life cycle of the organisation, how can we be the best we can at governing? And last of all, we're going to spend some time looking at crisis, because the life cycle of a board relates to different phases where crisis hits us. And I've spent the last few weeks working with a few organisations in crisis. So I decided actually let's look at some models of what happens when crisis occurs, because it's not if we have a crisis, it's when we have a crisis. It depends what it looks like. And boards need to be ready for that and aware that there are certain obligations and accountabilities they have during a crisis. So, just for those of you who haven't heard me say this before, is that I just want to check in about the language that I use. So in my presentations, I always talk about the board. Some of you will call this your committee or your management team, whoever that group of people who's in charge, the governance group, we're going to call them a board. I talk about managers. That's the senior person who's responsible for making sure all the work gets done. Sometimes we call them CEOs, coordinators. They're just separate from the board. And I talk about not-for-profit and community organisations. Those are all of those organisations out there, whatever their structure or form takes. That's just the terminology that I use. So just invite you to translate to whatever words you use. Let's talk about there's nothing so practical as a good theory. So what we're going to do tonight is have a look at a theory of life cycles. So some academics have studied organisations and have looked for patterns and seen patterns and come up with a theory that they then apply generally to all organisations. But it is just a theory. So our job is to say, well, if this is what the research says, what does that look like for us and what can we learn from that? So today's going to be based on a theory around life cycles. The thing for our boards, the thing for all of us is that we have a bit of a tension for us. We have extensive responsibilities and compliance, but actually we're voluntary and part-time. And this is something that we live with in our governance roles. And as leaders, because you're all leaders if you're on governance boards, you step up to that responsibility and work with it. At a certain point in all organisations, the board has to decide at what point will we delegate the responsibility for the work and for making decisions for this organisation to someone else. How much of our collective judgment are we willing to let somebody else take, and are we going to hire someone to take on that role? So that's the fundamental basis around the life cycle model, is that eventually boards get somebody else to make the decisions on their behalf and they hire a staff person to do the work. So just check in with your partners and the people at the table for our group discussions. Do you have paid staff in your groups? So just check in with your partners. Do you have someone paid to do the work and to take over your collective judgment? So is there any groups in here that don't have paid staff? You all have paid staff, yeah? You don't?
All three of us have organisations with more than one paid staff.
Oh, okay. So you're all from medium-sized organisations. So the life cycle model is going to fit you perfectly. Yeah. Those of you who don't have paid staff, it looks a little bit different for you. So the thing about community organisations is that they're formed when a group of people organise themselves because they're not happy with the way something is. So they see a need in the community, they see an issue that has to be addressed, they see perhaps not even something negative but something positive, like maybe we could use this resource for youth, or we could work with this group of people to help them to meet their aspirations. Whatever it is, a group of people say, we'd like to make something different, we'd like to create a change, and they come together as a group of people to do that. And then often this leads to the creation of an organisation. So we have something like 97,000 community organisations registered in New Zealand. Yeah, we love to form committees and make groups and work together collectively. So I just want you to, again with your partners, why was your organisation formed and what difference did it set out to make? So think back to the history of your organisation when it was first started. Why was it set up? What was it trying to achieve? It's taking us back to the beginning of your life cycle when you were first set up. Okay. Does anybody want to share with the rest of the group why their organisation was set up? Any volunteers?
Well, you need, in my situation, but yeah, you need a group to lead
Yes.
the group. Sort
Yep.
of.
Some leaders step forward.
Yeah.
And what was it they wanted to do?
To support and oversee.
Yep.
That's,
So they saw something in the community that was needed. Yeah. Any examples of the types of things that we see need to change? This one's an obvious one, eh? Like women who are experiencing violence in their lives. Group of people say that's just not good. They've got nowhere to go. Let's set up a refuge. Yeah.
It was actually a rape crisis.
A rape crisis. Yeah.
A group of women about 30 years ago, and the goal is to support these women and
Yeah.
also to eliminate sexual abuse in education.
Yep. What about Joe? What about your group? Why was it set up?
Well, Baden Powell set our group up
Yep.
a long time ago in another
Yep.
country.
Yep.
So it's just about parents with youth that want to give them some experiences that they might not otherwise
Yep.
get, and was originally set up for those that didn't have, rather
Yeah.
than for those that had.
Yeah, right. So originally someone said there's a group of boys here that don't have fathers. We need to do something about that. A few decades later, some group of people in New Zealand said, actually, we need to get, our boys experiencing, where can we go to join up with something?
And then in the 80s, they let us girls up.
Yeah. Cool. So fundamentally, we exist to make a change in the world somewhere. And that evolves over time with organisations. Sometimes their mission and their purposes change, but initially a group of people stepped up. And at that point, we start on our life cycle journey. So the first thing that happens to us as a group of people, we go through what we call the founding stage. 2 phases in the founding stage. First of all, we have what's called the collective phase. So the collective phase is this group of people who are really passionate and care about making this difference, get together and start to do the work. So they are the organisation. There isn't this thing called an organisation. There's a group of people who are doing the work. And they're working really hard and making the changes. They're starting to put some structures in place, like maybe some administration happens, start to coordinate people, maybe they bring others on board, maybe they organise volunteers. But at this point, there's no difference between them and the work of the organisation. What happens though is they start to get a little bit exhausted, and we move into what's called the sustaining phase. Between these 2 phases, a leader will step up. Someone from the board, usually the founder, will step up to lead what is now forming into an organisation. And that person may or may not be paid. So quite often it is the founder, or it might be someone that they bring in. So when we're in our sustaining phase, we usually have someone who's doing the work, and our board tend to spend most of their time socialising. They tend to delegate a lot of the decision making to the manager or the person who has taken over that role. And they don't really feel like they're contributing much to the organisation, because this person who's now being paid to do everything is making all of the decisions and driving things forward. Does that make sense? Anybody still in this phase? Has it been set up, or you've all moved on? Right. So at this point, we've got a paid person doing the work, and we've got a board who is starting to govern, or should be governing. But usually what happens is we have a crisis. So everything's chugging along really nicely. Our paid person's doing what they're supposed to be doing. Our board's doing a little bit of governance, making sure that they're legally compliant. But then there's a crisis. Something happens. So here's your job at your tables. What kinds of crisis do not-for-profit community organisations have? When we say crisis, what happens to us? Share some examples. Okay, friends, what does a crisis look like in a community organisation?
Money.
All right, loss of money.
Sudden resignations of paid staff.
So who's resigned, sorry?
Paid staff.
Right. So resignation.
And the board.
Board leaves. Employment issues.
Interpersonal conflict.
Conflict.
People not understanding the difference between governance and management.
Yep. Any other crises? Good. We might add to this list as we start to talk a little bit more about things that we've all seen. So what happens is a crisis rocks up. So we've got a group of people who were working really hard to get this organisation up and running. Someone came along and they hired them, may or may not have been the founder, and then we kick into this cycle. So we have a crisis, we move into what we call the super managing phase. So what happens is, because of the crisis, the board steps up and becomes more involved in the management of the organisation. So they start, whereas before that point, they totally relied on their manager for information and for decision making, they now step up to seek other alternative viewpoints of what's going on. Sometimes staff might be complaining to them, coming straight to them. They start to become more involved in the fundraising and the financial management. And at this point, the super managing phase, these governance management tensions really increase. And whoever it is that's been in that role as the paid person in charge, the relationship starts to break down between them and the board. Because they were kind of running things really well, thank you very much. And quite often, crises are not something internal. Sometimes it's something external will happen. And now all of a sudden the board's jumping in, that person starts to feel a bit bad about what's happening, and now the board's in my face and interfering and micromanaging. At a certain point, the board then kind of gets everything organised and starts to become a little bit better at governance and stepping back. They might have new staff in, they've got some systems and processes in place, got some funding in place, and they move into what we call the corporate phase. So the corporate phase is based on that traditional or standard governance model where the board is separate from the paid staff, and those two roles don't have much of an overlap. So in this phase, the board is still quite involved and paying attention and doing their job. Usually what happens over time though is they move into what we call a ratifying phase. And that means the board starts to get a bit more complacent, and the person, the manager or the executive director, is now starting to take over a lot more of the decision making and the work of the organisation, and the board just becomes a rubber stamping board. Eventually there will be a crisis and we start the whole cycle again, right? So just quickly, before we look at each of those in detail, in your group, where do you think your board is in its life cycle? Where are you sitting in your life cycle? This is an inevitable cycle. Where are you on your board? Corporate phase is kind of like the honeymoon phase. Things are going really well. Governance and management are doing their jobs. Ratifying is rubber stamping. Staff are making the decisions and running the show. Yep. Super managing, the board's running the show. So has everybody identified where they are or they think they are? Boards can go through this cycle a few times, yeah? If you're with an organisation for a while, we just keep on turning around this endless cycle. Some organisations this can take a year, other organisations it'll take 100 years. But the theory says that we will all go through these cycles at some time or another in our lives. So we're just going to look at each of these phases and explore them a bit further. The super managing phase is, the theory says that what happens at this point is that there are a lot of what they call MAPs, middle-aged professionals. So they say a group of the whole board usually gets taken over by middle-aged professionals who say, actually, this board needs to be a little bit more business-like. And if we were a bit more business-like, we wouldn't have faced that crisis that we had. And what we need to do is have some more systems, like some more plans and some KPIs and a few more policies and procedures. And if we just, smartened our act up a little bit, we wouldn't have had to face what we had just been through. Yeah. And at this point, the board, they say, act like consultants to the staff. So the board starts to tell the staff how they should be running this organisation, and everything has to go through them. Sometimes, if you've got a large staff, the staff will go around the manager or the executive director and start talking directly to the board. So the board starts to hear all the stories that have been going on, and then the board well, no wonder we had a crisis because this is all what's been going on. So they're getting multiple information from different places. Up until this point, the information that they've been getting has been coming from the manager. But now they realise that actually maybe we should have had other information or different perspectives, and they start to go outside of the organisation to become more informed. And the manager, however, sees these guys are micromanaging. Yeah, we had a crisis, we all have crisis, but actually they're now starting to take over. So we have all these middle-aged professionals turning this into a nice business-like organisation, and then we have this tension that happens with the manager. What I'd like you to talk about is if an organisation is in this phase, which results in tension between the manager and the board are just trying to do the best they can for the organisation because we've just had a crisis. What's some things you could do to potentially reduce that tension or make this a less exhausting phase for the board? So at this point, the board are in their boots and all doing everything. What things can we put in place to actually make this a less conflict, tension-filled, exhausting phase of your life? Just have that conversation. Help Tony out, team. What should Tony be doing at this point? Okay, team, what advice do we have for Tony? What are some things that we need to be doing in our board meeting time? Good communication? Frank and open discussions. Yep, some transparency.
Clear goals.
Some clear goals, yep. Kind of mocking the middle-aged professional theory a little bit, but actually some goals are a good idea, yeah?
A lot of compromising.
A lot of compromising, yeah? Because this is about relationships. So we've got a group of people stepping into the territory of someone who potentially actually set this organisation up, and we've got to somehow look after that relationship and to reduce the conflict and the tension, which will require some compromising. Yeah.
Maybe a bit of analysis of actually what went wrong, what caused the crisis, were we doing this rubber stamping prior?
Yep.
So missing things that were coming?
Yep.
Or was there something else that was completely out
That's right, yep.
of control?
Yeah. So thinking, how did we get here? How did we get into that crisis? How have we responded to that crisis? So a little bit more reflection.
Yes.
and a bit more conversations about how are we going to lead this organisation as a result of this crisis. What's our response? And what systems are we going to put in place so we don't go back there? But actually, how do we keep ourselves healthy as an organisation? And how do we maintain our governance roles without micromanaging? So the theory says at this point, our manager or our executive director will leave. And if it's a founder, they'll leave and it'll be unpleasant, because the founder or the person who was doing it when the organisation was set up was saying, I've been doing this for how many years? It's my baby and it's been taken away from me. So it's not a very pleasant time quite often, according to the theory. Not always like that, yeah. But this board, the super managing board, when it hires a new manager or it hires a new executive director, will look for someone who's quite professional. And so what they've done really is they forget about the mission. They've forgotten why they got set up in the first place. And they're driven by business processes and structure and making things right, rather than being driven by what it was that you got set up for in the first place. So because boards will go around this a couple of times, usually if you're in the super managing phase for your second or third time, you're a little bit more aware of that. And you'll make sure that you recruit board members and staff who have both the organisation management and passion for the mission at the same time. But your first time round, you skew a little bit to the super managing. So once we've kind of got our systems and our processes, and actually we're quite happy as a board how things are running, much more business-like. I think we've gotten over that crisis. That's not going to happen to us again. We move into our corporate phase. So at this point, the board's pretty exhausted because you're still volunteers and you're still part-time, and you've been rescuing this organisation and in there working really hard. And you start to leave the manager to it a little bit. You've made sure that they're acting a little bit more professionally and following the systems and processes you put in place. They start to back out and not be involved in the programming side, stick to policy, stick to strategy, and they start to trust the manager and the staff a little bit more and rely on them. The manager starts to do most of their communication with reports at this point. So instead of the ongoing involvement with what's going on, we start to see management or coordinators' reports coming before the meetings and getting information like that. So the separation between governance and management is starting to get into place. So quick conversation. If you're in this phase, which is pretty dreamy, how do we stay in there and not slip back to super managing or move to the ratifying? Just quick conversation. And how do we keep our heart, yeah? Because you don't want to be at corporate boardrooms. You might as well be in your paid job for that, yeah? Actually, how do we bring some heart into our organisations during this phase? So quick conversation. Okay, team. What are some of the things we should be doing in this corporate phase to ensure good governance and to keep us there? Any ideas?
Add a bit of fun.
Have a bit of fun, yep.
Yeah, acknowledgements and also having people contribute in some way. So
Yeah.
everyone is hooked in on some way.
To make it collaborative and collective and inclusive, yeah, rather than totally business-like. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Do a bit of a stock take, do some strategic planning.
Yeah.
See what the opportunities might be. Have different opportunities to engage with the manager rather than just the
Yep.
board meetings.
So we know that a board's role is strategy. That's one of the fundamental roles of a board, is we talk about get off the dance floor and onto the balcony. So in this phase, we've got to make sure that we do that, yeah? That we don't just slowly drift off and only look at policies and procedures as our role, but we make sure that we engage in strategy and we do some planning around that. And that we continue to build relationships with our internal and external stakeholders, that we don't become like a boardroom of Air New Zealand or the Bank of New Zealand. Yeah, because we are doing this because of our heart for community. So making sure that the community is at the centre of our conversations. Any other thoughts? Key one there though, getting that strategy happening. So usually what happens after a while is that things are going really well and we start to rely more and more on our staff again. It's kind of similar to that what happened in the founding phase, that we start to rely on the manager to give us information. Our independence turns into inertia independence. The board basically stops driving the agenda. And in organisations, the agenda for the board meetings gets written by the staff. So the board literally show up and the staff hand them the agenda for that meeting. That's the first sign that you've moved into a ratifying stage. Decision making is kind of ritualized, which means that we don't have robust arguments. We don't encourage different worldviews or different points of view. It's kind of like, let's just get this over and done with and have some votes. At this point, often the board don't know each other very well. So people have come onto the board and there hasn't been a process of you connecting as people and individuals. And sometimes the manager kind of does that deliberately. Tries to keep everybody at arm's length from the organisation, tries to keep everybody not having meetings in the car park after the meetings, because life is sweet for the manager and the staff. It's not that they are doing anything disrespectful or bad, it's just that sometimes boards get in the way of getting the work done. Yeah, so if we can set our boards up just to be rubber stamping boards, life is sweet for us as staff. But the board gets demotivated and has a lack of purpose. Yeah? So just quick conversation for this last phase. If you're in this phase, what are some things that you should be doing as a board? If this is where you're sitting, what are some things you can do to ensure that you go back to good governance? Quick, at your tables. So team, what do we need to do when we're sitting in our ratifying phase? When we identify, whoa, we're a bit of a rubber stamping board here, what should we do?
Ask questions. I would say you pick up, like if the staff does a report and you just say, can you explain that to me? How
Yes.
do you do it? Tell me more
Yes,
about it.
ask questions. Number one job of a board member is to ask questions. Yep. Any other thoughts?
I think the board member need to really have a heart for the organization.
Yep.
So the board member will need to possibly have more discussions, maybe not just in the meeting, maybe outside the meeting, have more social time together and
Yep.
knowing the things
Mm.
better. And
Yeah.
we use base camp in a base camp. It's a way that board member, we actually discuss a lot of issue outside the meeting.
Okay. So
Yeah.
Basecamp is an online
Online,
platform? Yeah?
online work platform.
Yeah.
Like online work platform.
Yeah. So we've got to get the board engaged with the purpose of the organisation again and excited about what it is, the difference that you're trying to make in the world. So not necessarily doing the work, but getting them excited about the possibilities that they could lead. So giving them opportunity to go back to a leadership role rather than being led by the staff. Yeah. Really need a strong chair at this point to actually be working in partnership with the staff around setting agendas and the reporting and everything that's happening, and so that the board and the staff are working in partnership rather than an uneven balance of power. The hardest bit about this phase is that board members resign. And during this phase you will have your smallest board ever, right down to only a few people. So the worst thing that happens is when you're back to your crisis, there's only a couple of suckers sitting on that board facing the crisis. Does that feel familiar? Yeah, we've all been on boards when there's like 2 or 3 of us and we have this crisis that we have to deal with. So in this phase, making sure that we have enough people on our board that are engaged, so when this happens, we're not just doing it with a few of us. So succession planning is really important in that corporate phase, so that by the time we get to the ratifying stage, we have a group of really good people, and keeping them engaged so that they don't leave before this happens. So we're going to go back to our crisis. It is inevitable, something will happen, usually because the board has shrunk and has been more and more distant from the work, so they haven't been paying attention to the detail, and something will happen. So I work with boards all the time when the board are like, we're not sure how we got here. It's like, your organisation is bankrupt, well, you're not looking at your financial reports. Yeah, you've been, the sign that you were heading to bankruptcy was 6-7 months ago. You didn't pay attention. They were like, but the manager never told us. It's like, well, yeah, you weren't supervising your manager, or the manager was out there furiously fundraising. And quite often in not-for-profits, we manage according to faith and hope principles, yeah? So usually not-for-profit management, that's what drives them. Things will be okay, we'll manage, but sometimes we can't. So we have a crisis will show up. If our boards are well functioning and are well organised and we're aware of these phases, we can minimise crisis. Yeah? And we can work with them and get in a position so that a crisis doesn't destroy our governance. So I have up here, and I think it's on your handout, these 7 warning signs of crisis. Yeah. And what I find really interesting is when I work with boards that are in crisis, they're like really surprised that they didn't notice it was coming. They go into denial. I have literally worked with boards that said we didn't see bankruptcy coming. I did a piece of work once for a board and staff, and what they wanted me to do was to help them gather some learnings from feedback they had gotten from one of their government funders. And in the report, the government funder said, we are unlikely to fund this organisation the same way again. And they were doing all this planning, and I'm just like, why are you planning through the learnings from the previous contract when you've got the statement in there that you're in? And they were just like, no, it'll be okay. And so guess what happened? Government funder was like, sorry, we're not going to fund you again. It's in the report, but they were in total denial that it was coming. Quite often I see boards that literally are lied to by their executive directors and their managers. That's a tricky one, eh? That we have quite a good relationship and all of a sudden this happens. And usually it's because the manager's feeling a bit vulnerable or things have started to go wrong and they're trying to rectify it and make things look okay. Yeah. I've actually seen funders go to organisations and say, there's a rumour around the community of what's going on in your organisation, you need to sort out this conflict or you need to sort this or that out or else we're not going to fund you. Sector gossip is huge because we're quite small in New Zealand. So if you get feedback, so such and such have told me that this is happening in your organisation, you need to listen to that. These are like red flags that things are not so great. And as a board, they're telling you that you need to look at things. And sometimes it's just purely number 7. A consultant like me will rock up, look at your stuff and go, actually guys, you got a crisis coming if you don't act. You need to act now or it's inevitable. Yeah. And like I said, boards go into denial. I worked with a group and I told them that if you don't sort this issue out, you're at risk of a personal grievance from your staff. No, they said it'll be okay. Now they're all in court, personal grievance from their staff. So we need to listen to the signals and listen to the signs. So just with your partners, any of these going on in your organisation, had any of these signs? And what happened? Just have a conversation. Seen any of these signals? So has everybody seen some of these signs in their organisations? Yeah. Here's the thing for us, it's like an aeroplane crash, right? If one of these things happen, we can handle that, we could fix that. More than one of these things, you've got a snowball and you've got an organisation in real crisis. Yeah, but each one of these on its own can cause a little bit of problem for you, but it is a signal. Few of those will happen usually at the same time. So if our internal and our external stakeholders are not happy and don't want to engage with us, if the staff are leaving, if other organisations don't want to partner with us, that's a real sign that our programs and our delivery are not going well, that there's something not right for us. So these are the things we have to pay attention to as a board. And this is why in a ratifying stage, you could see how you turn to a crisis, yeah? Because we don't hear about the stuff or we ignore them. So we do know that there's a few things that we need to do when it comes to crisis. And the first one is, as a board, you have to expect the unexpected. So as a board member, if you think your time on a board is going to be smooth sailing and just absolutely wonderful, actually that's not so. Stuff happens. And because we're working with people, and when you're working with people, this now is queer as folk, yeah? Like weird stuff happens. And sometimes, like I said, stuff will snowball. Boards, first of all, need to prevent a crisis. So preventing a crisis simply knowing that what a crisis looks like and doing some risk management. What are some of the things that could go wrong for us in this organisation, and what can we put in place to prevent them from happening? When a crisis happens, actually get in there and manage it, do something about it. So I've worked with groups who are in crisis and still think things are fine. They are literally bankrupt and they've got a little bit of funds and they're talking about, going on a board retreat. I'm just like, you need to start using the word, we are in crisis. Therefore, we have to go into crisis fund management. Yeah, so it's quite often boards won't use the word, so it's helpful to use the word because then you know you need to manage something. There's a difference between two types of crisis. One is an emergency. So an emergency is, like the municipal building on Bank Street is burning down and we've lost all our materials, or our staff have all quit, or our board have all gone. But we also have what's called controversy. So that is reputational crisis. So sometimes, actually, our funds are fine, our staffing's fine, everything's okay, but something has happened that impacts on our reputation as an organisation. And that's the start of a slippery slope. Once your reputation is impacted, all that other stuff will start to happen, and then you'll move into an emergency crisis. So when something happens to your reputation or people are talking about you, you need to manage it as a board. Yeah. Quite often what we will do as a board is we will blame things on external circumstances. So we'll say, the reason why this is happening is because the funder behaved in that way. Or the reason why this is happening is because the community has shifted to a different demographic. We always find external reasons for us to blame our crisis on, but sometimes we have to look inside and manage them from inside out. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's easy, 1, 2, 3 around crisis management. But it's not that easy because crisis is really exhausting when you're on a board because you're moving back into that super management phase where you're in their boots and all trying to work with the staff to tidy up whatever it is that's happened. But when it does hit the fan, when we're in our crisis, there is some advice from the literature and research. And it's like I said, first of all, know you're responsible as a board to name it. Our organisation is in crisis. We are a crisis board. Therefore, we have to act. And we are the leaders of this organisation. Therefore, we are responsible for tidying up what's going on here. And sometimes for some organisation, that conversation is, do we shut down or do we keep going? That usually comes up in crisis conversations. You need to be proactive. Sitting back and just expecting it all to sort itself out never ever happens. It will just get worse and worse until you will have no choice but shut your organisation down. You need to get the whole board involved because crisis management requires work. It requires people paying attention to detail. It requires people walking alongside and helping the staff deal with whatever's going on, which is why if there's only a couple of you left on the board, this is really hard because you end up working full-time for this organisation in crisis, which means your best leaders actually burn out eventually. The advice is to create a risk committee, so a group of people on the board who are managing or measuring the risk. Like if we do this, this is potentially what could happen. If we don't do this, this is what could potentially happen. I always tell organisations when they're having a crisis, they call me, they say, Sandy, what do we do? Number one thing that you need to do is check your policies. So when you're working in a crisis mode, go in and see what your policies tell you you should do. Because if you act outside of your constitution and your policies, you're potentially acting illegally. You must follow them. And if it's a staffing crisis, if you don't follow your policies and procedures, that's when your staff have grounds for a personal grievance. It's like you said that this was the complaints policy, you went off and did this, now I can legitimately have grounds for a grievance. I always tell people don't rely on lawyers, okay, because quite often groups will go straight for legal advice and I'm just like, be careful. I'm not saying don't get legal advice, but don't rely on your legal advice. Because the thing about lawyers is the minute we engage them, things first of all escalate to a different level. But also the advice that lawyers give you and work with you is within a legal viewpoint and a legal framework. So they don't take into consideration relationships, history, fuzzy stuff. They purely stick to interpreting the law. They say legally this is what you can and can't do. And all that fuzzy stuff, which is the world that you live in, often doesn't get addressed through legal advice. So get legal advice, but don't rely on it. Yeah, as a team, work together. You need to act fast. Like I said, if you deny that you're in a crisis and you just sit back and hope that, you know, things will come right, it's not a very good place to be. And lastly, modelling the behaviour you want to see. So sometimes when we're in crisis mode as leaders, we can become a little bit more assertive, less tolerant, less patient, a little bit harsher with people around our decision making, forming opinions of people. But that's not the behaviour we want of our staff, is it? So we want to model the behaviour that we want them to be using throughout this crisis. If we want them to be calm, then we need to be calm. If we want them to be considerate and to involve people and be compassionate for people, then we have to be the same way. So it's really easy for crisis boards to kind of almost go into a hyper efficiency, hyper managerial kind of mode, which is not a good place for us to be when we want to model to our staff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Any other questions about when you're in crisis? Anyone been in a crisis? Have a story to share? Anyone's got, we won't do that again?
We're in the middle of a crisis.
Yep.
Everything you're talking about is exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm quite new to it, but when I arrived, all of that stuff that you were talking about where, you know, you didn't trust one another, and there was all infighting in the board,
Yeah.
and staff didn't feel valued, and
Yeah.
everything you're saying, it's exactly it. When I walked in, I was like, holy cow, what have I walked into?
Yeah.
I went home and thought, do I really want to be on this board?
Yeah.
It was horrible.
Mm.
It was toxic and horrible.
It is horrible, yeah.
We're getting out of it, but
Yeah.
it's toxic.
Yeah. And you're volunteers, eh? So it's just like, why am I doing this? So I think the thing too that when we're in crisis is to remind ourselves, why are we doing this? Yeah, we're doing this for the benefit of the people in our community that need whatever it is our organisation does. And usually in crisis, we were just sharing before, that people forget that and they focus on the arguing and the infighting and who's right and who's wrong and what we shouldn't, and we forget about the people that we're trying to serve. So if we keep that in front of us, that will actually motivate us through a crisis. If it wasn't for our organisation, this group of people would not have whatever it is that you're providing. And that will keep you, you know, energised to what you do. Usually in a crisis, the leaders will step up on a board. And sometimes people who have left the board will come back, particularly the founders or the first wave of people on a board. So don't be afraid to get them to come back and help you out, because they had that passion and the energy and the heart for what you were doing in the first place, and they will come back and help to participate in the leadership again. So harness the leadership you have within and harness the leadership amongst your stakeholders as well. I'm a firm believer in not hiding the fact that we have a crisis. And I will always tell my funders, we're having a bit of a problem right now, because I think it's better that the funders hear it from you than they hear it from someone else. And in my experience, when you tell that to funders, they actually offer you more money to help you get through the crisis. Yeah, if you have a really good relationship with them, they'll say, what resources do you need to help get you through this hump? Because it's normal for organisations to go through rough patches. And funders know that. So it's not about never having rough patches or never having crisis. It's actually about responding appropriately when it does happen and minimising the fallout as a result. So we want to keep all our good people on board. Any questions about this? So really it's about get in there and act, yeah? I really like this poster. I just thought it was kind of nice. All visitors, please note, when there's moonlight, music, love and romance, you're advised to face the music and dance. Yeah. Last of all, it's about crisis communication. So someone mentioned before about communication. So good communication is fundamental to all good governance process. But when we're in a crisis, we need to actually start over-communicating a bit more. Because what really unsettles people in a crisis is not knowing what's going on and thinking that something's happening that's not. And when we have paid staff, they need to know that they can rely on you and trust you as a board, that you're dealing with what it is that you're dealing. So we have to communicate often with the staff to let them know. So here's a little process that I found when I've used it a couple of times. It works really well. It's like, we're in a crisis, what does our communication strategy need to look like? So first of all, know who's responsible for leading. So it's really good to have one or two people who are the spokespersons during a crisis. So it might be the chairperson and the manager, or it might just be the chairperson. But have somebody who's leading it and is visible in that. Work out who's available to help, like create a team around that person who's leading, and it might actually, like I said before, bringing people from outside the board into that team to help. You need to resource your crisis somehow. It just if you've got the funds, it just means that you can support the board a little bit more to do the work that it's doing, rather than expecting them to do everything for nothing. You might be able to bring in some expertise or some support to help them. The big one is what information is appropriate for the public. So before, when I was talking about your reputation, how much are we going to actually put out there and how much are we going to just keep with ourselves? So what is it that the face that we're willing to put on, and what information are we willing to share? So I've seen organisations who haven't had that conversation, and all of a sudden they're out there talking about their staff and their employees, and that's really inappropriate to talk about your staff and your employees in a public forum. Or they start talking about the funders or the stakeholders, and that's inappropriate as well. So just having that conversation, what are we going to say and what aren't we going to say? But at the same time, you want to appear transparent, because we've all seen it, when people come on the media and they're a bit defensive, we're like, actually, what are you trying to hide? What are you covering up? It's really useful in crisis to have what we call key messages. So especially for the people who are doing the leading, what are some phrases or sentences that we want to use? And really good in the corporate world, where they have professional PR people, they're really good at this, yeah? So next time you're watching a corporate person on the TV trying to explain why something's just gone really bad inside Vodafone or Spark or whatever, like, listen for their key messages, They use certain words. And the last one, who's going to do that speaking on behalf? So when you're into crisis, have a communication plan, because it's the fundamental essence of you being able to manage that correctly. So team, that's all I had in terms of life cycles aboard and in crisis. Just really that we will go through the cycle quite often, once we've gotten through our founding phase. So just having good systems and good processes in place to minimise the collateral damage as we go through our crises and we move into these different phases. And just being hyper aware that these exist so that we can move through some of them faster than others. Yeah. Does that make sense? Cool. Any final questions? Okay. So just wishing you all well in your crises, yeah?
Wishing no crisis.
And may all your crises be small ones. Okay.
It's just happy families, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Families have discussions.
That's true.